In the silence of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath the weight of forgotten millennia, there existed a truth so profound that it was deliberately obscured from history. We know the Anunnaki as the gods who descended to Earth, who shaped humanity, who built the first civilizations. But what if they were not the apex of the celestial hierarchy? What if, hidden within clay tablets that scholars dismissed as myth, there lies evidence of beings so powerful, so incomprehensible, that even the Anunnaki trembled before them? Tonight, we journey through forbidden texts and suppressed translations to uncover the ultimate question that ancient scribes dared to answer. Who commanded the commanders? Who ruled the rulers of Earth? In the silence of the desert night, where the ancient land of Mesopotamia stretches beneath an infinite canopy of stars, the wind moves across the sand as it has for countless millennia, carrying whispers of forgotten ages and secrets buried beneath the weight of time itself. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow onward through the darkness, their waters silver under the moon, tracing the same paths they carved when the first cities rose from the fertile plains between them. Here in this sacred geography, where the ruins of Ur and Uruk and Eridu emerge like bones from the earth, we begin our journey into mysteries that have waited patiently for those willing to listen. The ziggurat towers that once scraped the heavens now stand as broken sentinels, their mud brick crumbling, but their purpose still echoing across the ages. For these were the places where humanity first reached upward to touch the divine, and where the divine reached down to touch humanity. The stars above are the same stars that the Sumerian priests watched from their temple platforms 5,000 years ago. The same cosmic lights they charted and named, and wove into stories of gods who descended from the heavens to walk among mortals. Beneath the sands of modern Iraq, beneath the war-torn landscapes and the forgotten tells, lies the cradle of civilization itself. And buried within that cradle are thousands upon thousands of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks that hold the oldest written records of human thought. These tablets rest now in museum basements across the world, in the British Museum and the Louvre and the University of Pennsylvania, stacked in boxes and drawers. And the remarkable truth is that most of them have never been fully translated or even carefully studied. Scholars estimate that only a fraction of the recovered cuneiform texts have been properly examined, which means that secrets of immense importance may still lie dormant, waiting for the right eyes to read them and the right minds to understand what they contain. The scribes who pressed their reed styluses into wet clay believed absolutely that they were recording truth, that the stories of the gods were not mere mythology, but actual history, accounts of real beings who shaped the world and everything in it. They wrote with reverence and precision, copying older tablets and preserving traditions that stretched back into the mists of prehistory. And they did so because they understood themselves to be the keepers of knowledge that must never be lost. Among the beings they wrote about most frequently were those known as the Anunnaki, a name that has echoed through alternative history circles and ancient astronaut theories and countless documentaries seeking to understand who these entities truly were. The Anunnaki have become familiar figures to modern seekers, portrayed as the gods who came from the stars, who created humanity, who ruled over the first civilizations with power and wisdom beyond human comprehension. But tonight, we ask a different question, a question that the tablets themselves seem to pose when read with careful attention. Were the Anunnaki truly the ultimate authority in the cosmic hierarchy, or were they themselves subordinate to powers even greater, even older, even more mysterious than the descending gods of Sumer? The evidence, scattered across clay tablets and cylinder seals and temple inscriptions, suggests that the Anunnaki were not the apex of the divine order, but rather administrators within a vast hierarchy that stretched upward into realms they themselves could barely comprehend. This is not presented as definitive truth, but as an exploration, an invitation to journey through the ancient texts and discover what they reveal about the structure of existence itself. We enter this territory with open minds and wondering hearts, prepared to encounter mysteries that have waited thousands of years for those willing to venture beyond the familiar narratives. The desert wind carries us now from the empty plains toward the distant glow of temple fires, where the priests chant hymns to beings whose true nature remains shrouded in the mists of deep time. The name Anunnaki itself opens doorways into complexity and scholarly debate that reveal how difficult it is to pin down exactly what these beings were understood to be by those who first wrote about them. In Sumerian cuneiform, the script that emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 3400 BCE and became the first true writing system in human history, words carry multiple layers of meaning that resist simple translation into modern languages. The term Anunnaki is typically rendered as those of royal blood or princely offspring, suggesting divine nobility. But alternative readings propose that it means those who from heaven to earth came, an interpretation that has fueled decades of speculation about extraterrestrial origins. The scholarly debate over this single word illustrates a broader truth about our engagement with these ancient sources, which is that translation is never neutral and always involves choices that shape what we think the ancients were trying to tell us. When Victorian scholars first deciphered cuneiform in the mid-19th century, they brought with them assumptions rooted in their own religious and cultural backgrounds, and these assumptions influenced which texts received attention and how they were interpreted for modern audiences. Some passages that seemed too strange or too contradictory to existing narratives were quietly set aside, dismissed as corrupted copies or primitive confusion. And only recently have researchers begun to revisit these overlooked materials with fresh eyes. The primary sources for understanding the Anunnaki come from a handful of major texts that have survived the ravages of time in sufficient completeness to be studied in depth. The Enuma Elish, often called the Babylonian creation epic, tells the story of how the god Marduk rose to supremacy among the gods by defeating the primordial chaos dragon Tiamat, and in doing so established the order of the cosmos and assigned the Anunnaki their places in the celestial hierarchy. The Atrahasis Epic, older still, describes the creation of humanity by the gods to serve as laborers, relieving the lesser gods called the Igigi from the burden of maintaining the world, and it contains the oldest known flood narrative, predating the biblical story of Noah by more than 1,000 years. The Eridu Genesis, fragmentary but precious, now provides another account of early humanity and the gods who shaped our earliest civilizations. These texts were not written as entertainment or speculation, but as sacred knowledge, preserved and transmitted by temple schools, where young scribes spent years mastering the complex art of cuneiform writing. The Sumerians and their successors, the Akkadians and Babylonians, understood these stories as accounts of actual events that had shaped the world they inhabited, and they treated them with the reverence we might reserve for the most important historical documents. Within the texts, a clear hierarchy emerges among the Anunnaki themselves, with certain gods holding supreme authority while others served in subordinate roles. At the apex stood Anu, the Sky Father, and whose name literally means heaven, and who ruled from the celestial realms as the ultimate authority among the gods. Below Anu came Enlil, the Lord of the Command, who served as the executive power of the Divine Council, and whose word was law among both gods and mortals. Enlil dwelt in the sacred city of Nippur, and his temple Ekur was considered the bond between heaven and earth, the place where divine decrees were issued and the fates of nations decided. Alongside Enlil stood his half-brother Enki, known to the Akkadians as Ea, the Lord of Wisdom and the Deep Waters, who dwelt in the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, and who was credited with the creation of humanity and the preservation of knowledge through the Great Flood. These three, Anu, Enlil, and Enki, formed the highest tier of the Anunnaki, but beneath them existed dozens of other deities with their own domains and responsibilities. Nana, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, Inanna, the queen of heaven, Nergal, the lord of the underworld, and countless others populated the Mesopotamian pantheon in a complex web of relationships and rivalries. Below the great Anunnaki were the Igigi, a class of younger or lesser gods who served their seniors, and who, according to the Atrahasis Epic, eventually rebelled against the labor imposed upon them, leading to the creation of humanity as a replacement workforce. This hierarchy, with Anu at its summit and the Igigi at its base, represents the standard understanding of Mesopotamian divine order, the framework that most scholars recognize and that most popular accounts describe. While the alternative perspective introduced by researcher Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s reinterpreted this hierarchy through the lens of ancient astronaut theory, proposing that the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings, but extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth seeking gold and created humanity through genetic engineering to serve as miners. Sitchin's books, beginning with The 12th Planet, sold millions of copies and sparked a cultural phenomenon that continues to influence how many people think about ancient Mesopotamia and human origins. His translations and interpretations have been criticized by mainstream scholars as creative misreadings of the original texts, but they have also opened doors for many seekers who sense that the conventional explanations for these ancient stories fail to capture their full significance. Whether one accepts Sitchin's specific claims or not, his work raised important questions about why these ancient accounts so consistently describe beings descending from the heavens, creating humanity, and ruling over the first civilizations with technologies and knowledge far beyond what early humans could have developed on their own. The debate between mainstream scholarship and alternative interpretation remains unresolved, but for our purposes tonight, the crucial question lies elsewhere. Whether the Anunnaki were supernatural gods or advanced beings from another world, the deeper mystery remains. Were they the ultimate source of authority in the cosmos? Nor did they themselves answer to something higher? When we read the texts carefully, curious passages emerge that suggest even Anu, the supreme Sky Father, operated within constraints he did not create and answered to principles beyond his control. The concept of fate, called Namtar in Sumerian and Shimtu in Akkadian, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as a force that even the greatest gods could not override. Destinies were fixed by powers that the texts describe in vague and reverent terms. And once fixed, even the assembled might of the Anunnaki could not change them. When Enlil decreed the flood that would destroy humanity, he did so because the fate of mortals had been determined. And when Enki secretly warned the sage Utnapishtim to build an ark and preserve life through the deluge, he was not overriding fate, but fulfilling another aspect of it. This suggests that the Anunnaki, for all their power, were themselves instruments of cosmic forces they served rather than controlled. The texts speak of divine assemblies, where the gods gathered to make decisions, and in these assemblies, even Anu deferred to the collective will, suggesting that no single god, not even the Sky Father himself, held absolute autonomous authority. These passages have often been overlooked or minimized by scholars focused on understanding the individual gods and their attributes. But they point toward a deeper cosmological structure that merits careful exploration. To understand what the Anunnaki truly were and who they might have answered to, we must turn to the texts themselves, including those that have been labeled forbidden, not because they were physically hidden, but because they were ignored, marginalized, or inadequately studied by generations of scholars, working within paradigms that could not accommodate their implications. The concept of forbidden knowledge evokes images of locked vaults and suppressed documents. But in the case of ancient Mesopotamian texts, the forbidding has been more subtle. Academic specialization means that many cuneiform tablets sit untranslated simply because there are not enough scholars trained in the necessary languages and scripts to study them all. Religious assumptions, particularly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, led researchers to dismiss certain passages as confused or corrupt when they contradicted accepted theological frameworks. Colonial attitudes toward non-Western cultures encouraged scholars to treat Mesopotamian religion as primitive mythology rather than sophisticated cosmological thought, deserving serious philosophical engagement. The result is that many texts containing crucial information about the divine hierarchy have been published, but not widely discussed, translated but not deeply analyzed, available but effectively invisible to all but the most dedicated specialists. The Atrahasis Epic stands as perhaps the most important of these undertreated sources, containing not only the famous flood narrative, but also detailed accounts of cosmic organization that predate and inform the better-known Enuma Elish. This text, preserved on tablets dating to the 17th century BCE, but recording traditions far older, describes a cosmos in which the great gods make decisions through council and consensus, where labor is divided among divine classes, and where the creation of humanity emerges from specific cosmic necessities rather than arbitrary divine whim. The Atrahasis Epic places the creation of humans within a framework of divine politics, with the Igigi gods striking against their Anunnaki superiors and the senior gods responding by creating a new labor force from the blood of a slain deity mixed with clay. This is not a simple creation myth, but a complex cosmological narrative revealing tensions and hierarchies within the divine order itself. The Enuma Elish, while more famous, contains depths that are rarely plumbed by popular accounts focused on the dramatic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. Before that conflict, before the gods we know by name had taken their places, the text describes a primordial state in which only the mingling waters of Apsu and Tiamat existed, the sweet waters and the salt waters whose union generated all the gods. This means that the Anunnaki themselves emerged from something more fundamental, that they were not the original state of existence, but rather the offspring of cosmic principles that preceded them. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish explicitly state that when the heavens above had not been named, and the earth below had not been called by name, when nothing but primordial waters existed, the first gods were generated within those waters. This is not a minor detail, but a cosmological statement of immense importance, establishing that the gods arose from something rather than being eternal and self-existent. Whatever that something was, the primordial state that preceded all the named deities, it represents a level of the hierarchy above the Anunnaki themselves. The later compilation known as the Book of Enki, or the Lost Book of Enki, while controversial in its origins and dating, draws together traditions that speak directly to the question of higher authority. In these texts, Enki himself appears to acknowledge that he and his fellow Anunnaki operate within constraints they did not establish, that their decisions are bounded by cosmic laws and principles that preceded their existence. References to the great above and the great below suggest a cosmological architecture far more complex than a simple pantheon of gods ruling from heaven, hinting at realms and powers that even the Anunnaki understood only dimly. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets waiting in museum collections, scholars continue to find fragments that complicate and enrich our understanding of Mesopotamian cosmology. New translations and reinterpretations appear regularly in academic journals, often challenging established views and opening new lines of inquiry. The work of translation is slow and painstaking, requiring mastery of dead languages and damaged texts. And the sad reality is that many tablets will likely never receive the attention they deserve, simply because there are not enough qualified scholars and not enough funding to support this essential research. What secrets still lie dormant in those clay fragments we cannot say, but the possibility that transformative revelations remain to be discovered adds urgency and excitement to our exploration of what is already known. With these ancient witnesses as our guides, we begin to look upward, beyond Anu, beyond the familiar hierarchy of the Anunnaki, into the primordial depths where the first powers stirred before the gods were born. The divine laws known as the Me provide our first clear evidence of authority beyond the Anunnaki themselves. The Me were fundamental decrees that governed all aspects of civilization and cosmic order, including kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, music, writing, and dozens of other essential aspects of existence. Crucially, the Anunnaki did not create the Me, but rather received them, guarded them, and occasionally transferred them from one god to another. The famous myth of Inanna and Enki describes the goddess traveling to the Abzu and obtaining the Me from her father Enki, who had been their custodian. But if Enki was merely the guardian of the Me, who created them? The texts do not provide a clear answer, but they consistently treat the Me as existing independently of any individual god, as fundamental principles that the divine order administers rather than originates. This points toward a source of authority and law above the Anunnaki, a cosmic constitution that the gods themselves were bound to uphold. The divine assemblies described in multiple texts reinforce this picture of distributed and constrained authority. When major decisions needed to be made, the gods gathered in council, debated among themselves, and reached collective determinations that bound all parties. Even Anu, the nominal supreme god, participated in these assemblies rather than issuing unilateral decrees. When the assembly decided on the flood, when they determined the fates of cities and kings, when they assigned domains and duties among themselves, they did so through a process that no single god, however powerful, could override. But assemblies do not create themselves. Someone or something must establish the rules by which assemblies operate, determine who may participate, define how decisions will be reached. The texts never explicitly name this founding authority, but its existence is implied by the very operation of the divine council. Some principle or power beyond the assembled gods established the framework within which they deliberate, and this constitutional power represents another level of the hierarchy above the Anunnaki. Perhaps most significantly, the concept of fate itself points toward cosmic forces that transcend divine will. The god Namtar, whose name literally means fate or destiny, served as a divine minister in the underworld, but the concept he embodied extended far beyond any single deity. Fate in Mesopotamian thought was not merely what the gods decided would happen, but a fundamental structure of reality that determined what could and could not be. Even when the gods wished to change an outcome, they found themselves constrained by fates already fixed. The Anunnaki could shape events within certain boundaries, but those boundaries themselves were set by powers beyond their control. If the gods are subject to fate, then fate itself represents a higher level of existence than the gods, a principle or power to which even the mightiest Anunnaki must submit. This is precisely the hidden hierarchy that the ancient texts reveal when read with attention to these often overlooked passages. As the first light of understanding breaks across our consciousness, we begin to perceive the outline of something vast beyond the Anunnaki. They were powerful, yes. They shaped our world, our flesh, our fate. But they too looked upward. They too received commands. They too trembled before powers older than the stars themselves. The comfortable narrative of the Anunnaki as ultimate creators and rulers begins to dissolve as we recognize their place within a cosmic order they did not establish and could not fully comprehend. They received the me from somewhere. They operated within an assembly whose rules preceded them. They submitted to fates they could not override. At every turn, the texts point beyond the familiar gods towards something more fundamental, more ancient, more mysterious. And it is to these primordial forces that we now turn our attention, descending through the ages to the moment before creation itself, when the first stirrings of existence began to move through the infinite dark, when the waters that would give birth to all the gods had not yet separated into their forms, when something nameless and vast held all potential within its unfathomable depths. The Anunnaki await us in the stories to come, but first we must meet their parents and their parents before them, climbing the ladder of existence toward the source from which all hierarchies descend. We cross now into deeper waters, into the time before time itself had meaning, into the darkness that preceded every dawn that has ever broken across any world. The ancient Babylonian priests, those keepers of sacred knowledge who spent their lives studying the movements of stars and the patterns of fate, began their most sacred text with words that still echo through the millennia with haunting power. When the heavens above did not exist, they wrote, when the earth beneath had not come into being, when there was no field, no marsh, no reed, nothing but endless, formless, eternal waters stretching in every direction without limit or boundary. This is where our journey truly begins, at the very edge of existence itself, at the moment before moments began. The Enuma Elish, that ancient Babylonian creation epic inscribed on 7 clay tablets and discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, does not begin with the gods. It begins with what came before the gods, with the primordial state from which all divinity emerged. This is a profound admission, one that transforms our entire understanding of the Anunnaki and their place in the cosmic order. They were not the beginning. They were not the source. They came from something older, vaster, more fundamental than anything we normally associate with the word divine. Picture, if you can, an existence without form, without structure, without the separation of one thing from another. There is no up or down, no light or darkness, no here or there. There is only water, endless water, but even the word water fails to capture what the ancients described. These were the primordial waters, conscious and alive, pregnant with all possibility yet manifesting none of it, containing everything that would ever be, while being nothing in particular. And within this infinite expanse of potential, 2 presences existed, 2 aspects of the primordial whole, 2 beings so vast and so ancient that calling them gods seems almost inadequate. Apsu was his name, the first masculine principle, the primordial fresh water that would one day become the rivers and springs and underground reservoirs of the world. But in that time before time, Apsu was not merely an element. He was a being, conscious and aware, with thoughts and feelings and will. The texts describe him as dwelling in peace within the infinite expanse, content in the eternal stillness, savoring the perfect quiet of existence before creation complicated everything with noise and motion and change. When we speak of Apsu, now we must release our modern tendency to reduce ancient concepts to mere natural phenomena. The Babylonians were not simply personifying the water cycle when they spoke of him. They were describing an entity of incomprehensible age and power, a being who existed before the concept of existence had any meaning, whose consciousness predated every thought that any god would ever think. Apsu represents the male principle of the primordial state, the generative potential that would contribute half of everything that would ever come into being. And yet, for ages beyond counting, he remained in stillness, in peace, in the unbroken serenity of pre-creation existence. His domain would later become the Abzu, that mysterious realm of underground waters that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, the source of all springs and rivers, the dwelling place of wisdom itself. But before the earth existed, before there was any beneath or above, Apsu simply was, a vast consciousness of fresh water stretching through infinity, mingling at its edges with his eternal consort. She was called Tiamat, the primordial salt sea, the great mother of all that would ever exist, and her name would echo through millennia as both creator and destroyer, as the source of gods and the enemy of gods, as the body from which the very heavens and earth would be fashioned. Tiamat represents the female principle of the primordial state, the receptive potential that receives and nurtures and brings forth the dark waters of infinite possibility that hold within themselves every form that creation would ever manifest. The texts describe her in various ways across different periods and traditions, sometimes as a serpent or dragon, sometimes as a great sea monster. But these later characterizations reflect the conflicts that would eventually arise between her and her descendants. In the beginning, before any conflict, before any form at all, Tiamat was simply the salt sea, the vast feminine counterpart to Apsu's fresh waters, the mother who had not yet given birth to anything, because time itself had not yet begun to flow. We must pause here and allow the enormity of this concept to settle into our awareness like sediment drifting through deep water. The Anunnaki, those beings we have discussed as the gods of ancient Sumer and Babylon, those entities whom some believe descended to Earth and shaped human destiny, were not the beginning of the story. They were grandchildren, perhaps even great-grandchildren, born in a lineage that stretched back to beings so primordial that they existed before the universe itself took form. When we ask who commanded the Anunnaki, who stood above them in the hierarchy of cosmic power, the texts point us first to these primordial parents, to Apsu and Tiamat, to the conscious waters that preceded all creation. The mingling of these two vast beings marks the first event in cosmic history, the first stirring that would eventually lead to everything we know. The fresh waters of Apsu and the salt waters of Tiamat came together, mixing and merging in the infinite expanse, and from this mingling, the first gods began to emerge. Imagine the meeting of two infinite oceans, one fresh and one salt, their waters intertwining in endless combinations, and from each new mixture, a new consciousness arising, a new divine being taking form from the creative union of the primordial parents. Lahmu and Lahamu came first, beings whose very names seemed to echo the sound of waters lapping against shores that did not yet exist. They were followed by Ansha and Kisha, greater than their predecessors, more defined in their powers and their persons. And from Ansha came Anu, the Sky Father, and from Anu came the generation that would include Enlil and Enki, and from them the great pantheon of Anunnaki that the Mesopotamian civilizations would worship for thousands of years. Do you see the hierarchy emerging from the primordial waters? The Anunnaki did not create themselves. They did not spring into existence from nothing. They were born, generation after generation, from parents who were born from parents, in a lineage that stretched back to Tiamat and Apsu themselves. This genealogy of the gods places the Anunnaki not at the top of the cosmic order, but several levels down from the true source. They were powerful, yes. They shaped worlds and created humanity and determined the fates of nations. But they were children of children of children, inheriting their power from sources far more ancient and fundamental than themselves. The commands they followed, the patterns they implemented, the very consciousness with which they thought and felt and decided, all of this flowed down to them from the primordial waters that preceded all existence. And this brings us to a crucial understanding that transforms everything we think we know about these ancient gods. The primordial waters were not mindless. They were not mere elements that happened to produce consciousness through some accident of combination. Tiamat and Apsu were themselves conscious, aware, purposeful beings who existed before any other consciousness in the universe. They could think, feel, make decisions, experience satisfaction and disturbance. The texts tell us that Apsu grew disturbed by the noise of his descendants, that he could no longer rest in peace as he had for ages before creation filled the void with motion and sound. Tiamat is described as having emotions, preferences, the capacity for rage and sorrow and determined action. These were not story elements added to make the myths more interesting. These were fundamental claims about the nature of primordial reality, assertions that consciousness did not emerge from matter but preceded it. That awareness was not a late development in cosmic evolution, but was present at the very beginning, in the very waters from which all else would flow. The Anunnaki then did not create consciousness. They inherited it. They received it from their parents, who received it from their parents, who received it from Tiamat and Apsu themselves. And if consciousness existed in the primordial waters, what does this suggest about the source of those waters? What does this imply about whatever might have preceded even Tiamat and Apsu in the great chain of being? These are the questions that carry us deeper still into the mystery, questions that the ancient scribes themselves dared to ask in their most sacred and hidden texts. But even Tiamat and Apsu, vast as they were, ancient as they were, emerged from something. The texts speak of a state before even the primordial waters separated into their forms, a state that contains the seed of our ultimate answer. Here we must speak of Mumu, the mysterious third presence that appears alongside Tiamat and Apsu in the earliest passages of the creation texts, the figure that scholars have puzzled over for more than a century and whose true significance may hold the key to understanding the highest levels of the cosmic hierarchy. Mumu is often translated as the vizier of Apsu, a kind of minister or advisor who stood at the primordial father's side. But this translation may dramatically underestimate the importance and the nature of this enigmatic being. The name Mumu appears to be related to ancient words, meaning pattern, form, mold, and also to words for creative power, for the force that gives shape to the shapeless. Some scholars have connected Mumu to the concept of the Logos that would appear in later Greek and Hebrew philosophy, the divine word or reason that underlies and organizes all reality. Others have interpreted Mumu as a kind of primordial mist or cloud, an intermediary state between pure formlessness and manifest form. But perhaps the most profound interpretation sees Mumu as the principle of form itself, the cosmic intelligence that determines how potential becomes actual, how the infinite possibilities within Tiamat and Apsu collapse into the specific forms of created beings. If this interpretation holds truth, then Mumu represents something even more fundamental than the primordial waters themselves. For water, whether fresh or salt, has form. It flows, it mingles, it has qualities and characteristics that distinguish it from other possibilities. What gives water its form? What determines that Apsu should be fresh and Tiamat should be salt? What decides how their mingling should produce gods rather than chaos, consciousness rather than mere matter? The answer, according to this reading of the ancient texts, is Mumu. The implications of this understanding cascade through our entire hierarchical model, like ripples spreading across still water. If Mumu is the principle of form, then Mumu preceded Tiamat and Apsu in at least one crucial sense. The primordial waters had form, had characteristics, had identity. They could not have had these things without some principle of formation operating upon or within them. This places Mumu not below or beside the primordial parents, but in some sense above them, as the intelligence that shaped their very nature before they went on to shape everything else. The hierarchy extends upward once again, beyond what we expected, beyond the beings we thought were the beginning. Mumu represents the first clear evidence of what the scribes called the principles above the gods, the forces and forms that even the mightiest divine beings must work within. When the myths tell us that Mumu stood at Apsu's side, where they describe him as a vizier offering counsel, we might understand this as a poetic expression of a profound metaphysical truth. Form advises being. Pattern shapes potential. The principle of what things should be guides the raw power of what things could be. And if Mumu gave form to Tiamat and Apsu, what gave form to Mumu? Who or what determined the pattern by which patterns themselves operate? We begin to perceive an infinite regression stretching upward through levels of abstraction, each level more fundamental than the last, each level providing the foundation upon which the level below it stands. The modern tendency to reduce ancient mythologies to simple dualities has caused us to overlook Mumu almost entirely. We remember the drama of Tiamat and Apsu, the conflict between chaos and order, the cosmic battle between the primordial mother and her rebellious offspring. These dualistic frameworks make for compelling narratives, for clear moral distinctions, for the kind of stories that survive across generations. But the original texts preserve a third presence, a figure who does not fit neatly into the duality. Mumu suggests that the Mesopotamian understanding of cosmology was far more sophisticated than our simplified versions acknowledge. Mumu is the suppressed third, the overlooked factor, the complexity that disappears when we reduce these ancient texts to their most basic elements. And in that overlooked complexity lies precisely the answer we are seeking, the evidence of hierarchies above the Anunnaki, structures of power and being that extended far beyond what the popular versions of these myths describe. We might ask why this complexity was simplified, why later traditions and modern retellings have largely ignored Mumu in favor of the more dramatic figures. Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of esoteric knowledge itself. Throughout history, the deepest truths have often been preserved in forms that require interpretation, in symbols and stories that reveal their full meaning only to those who seek carefully and think deeply. The average worshipper in an ancient Babylonian temple would have known the stories of Tiamat and Marduk, of the great battle and the creation of the world from the dragon's body. But the priests, the scribes, the keepers of the most sacred knowledge, they preserved and transmitted a more complete understanding, one that included Mumu, one that acknowledged the principles above the waters, one that pointed toward hierarchies that the common stories never mentioned. Tiamat, Apsu, Mumu, the first triad, the primordial three. The Anunnaki emerged from their creative union, born generation after generation from the mingling of these cosmic forces. But the texts reveal another truth, one that takes us even higher in the hierarchy of being. Even these cosmic parents operated within constraints, followed patterns not of their own making, obeyed laws that preceded their own existence. The tablets of destiny appear in multiple Mesopotamian myths as objects of supreme power, items so potent that whoever possessed them controlled the very fate of the universe. Let us contemplate these mysterious tablets, for in them we find perhaps the clearest evidence of a cosmic order that transcends even the primordial forces we have just described. The name itself tells us much. Tablets of destiny, not tablets of power or tablets of the gods, but tablets upon which destiny itself was written. Destiny here means something far more profound than what we might casually mean when we use the word today. The Mesopotamian concept of destiny referred to the fundamental nature and fate of all things, the decree that established what each being was and what each being would become. The gods themselves had destinies, fixed natures and predetermined paths that they could not escape no matter how powerful they were. And these destinies were not merely abstract concepts. They were written, inscribed, recorded on tablets that existed as the foundation of all cosmic order. The tablets of destiny appear in the Enuma Elish in a particularly revealing context. Before the great battle between Marduk and Tiamat, the dragon mother takes the tablets and gives them to Kingu, her chosen champion, to wear upon his breast. This act transfers supreme cosmic authority to Kingu, making him the most powerful being in existence for as long as he possesses the tablets. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and slays Kingu, he takes the tablets for himself, and it is this possession, as much as his victory in battle, that establishes his supremacy among the gods. But notice what this implies about the nature of divine power. Marduk did not become supreme because of his inherent nature or his own abilities alone. He became supreme because he possessed the tablets of destiny, because he held the object upon which the fates of all beings were inscribed. The tablets were the source of authority, not the gods who held them. The tablets could be stolen, as indeed they were in another famous myth, when the bird god Anzu snatched them from Enlil and threw the entire divine order into chaos. The panic that this theft caused among the Anunnaki reveals their fundamental dependence on these mysterious objects. Without the tablets, they could not fix destinies, could not maintain cosmic order, could not exercise the authority that defined their divine status. They were administrators of an order they had not created, executors of a system that existed independently of their own being. The question we must ask, the question that leads us higher still in the hierarchy, is simply this: who created the tablets of destiny? The texts do not clearly answer this question, and their silence is itself significant. The tablets appear in the myths as existing, as being present, without any account of their origin. They were not made by Marduk, who only received them after his victory. They were not made by Tiamat, who possessed them but passed them to another. They were not made by Anu or Enlil or any of the Anunnaki, for these gods strove to obtain the tablets precisely because they lacked them. The tablets seem to pre-exist all the conflicts between gods, to have been present before the generations that produced the Anunnaki, to exist as a fundamental feature of reality rather than as a creation of any divine being. If the gods did not create the tablets of destiny, then either the tablets created themselves, or they were created by some force or being above all the gods we have yet discussed. Either possibility points to a level of the hierarchy above what we have previously encountered. If the tablets are self-existent, then they represent an impersonal cosmic principle that transcends all personal divine beings, and a foundation of fate and order that the gods themselves must bow before. If the tablets were created by a higher being, then we have discovered evidence of the ultimate source, the apex of the hierarchy, the power that established the very framework within which all else operates. The power contained in the tablets of destiny deserves careful contemplation, for it illuminates the nature of the cosmic order within which the Anunnaki operated. The tablets determined what the Mesopotamians called the fixing of destinies, the fundamental decree that established the nature and fate of all beings. This was not merely predicting the future or controlling what would happen. This was determining what things were in their essential nature, what purposes they served, what roles they played in the cosmic drama. When a destiny was fixed, it became unalterable, part of the deep structure of reality that no power could change. Even the greatest gods could not escape their fixed destinies, could not alter the fundamental decrees that established their natures and their fates. They could exercise tremendous power within their destinies, but they could not transcend the boundaries that those destinies set. The tablets of destiny were thus not merely powerful objects. They were the very constitution of reality, the cosmic law that governed all existence. And this law existed independently of the gods who lived under it. The tablets represent an order that preceded the Anunnaki, that preceded perhaps even Tiamat and Apsu, that existed as the foundation upon which all else was built. When we ask who commanded the Anunnaki, who stood above them in the hierarchy of cosmic power, the tablets of destiny provide part of the answer. The Anunnaki were bound by destinies they did not create, following a cosmic order that existed before them and would continue to exist regardless of their actions. They were not the ultimate lawgivers. They were followers of laws that had been given by something higher still. We must also return here to the concept of the me that we introduced earlier, for the me and the tablets of destiny are intimately connected as expressions of the same fundamental truth about the cosmic hierarchy. The me were the divine decrees, the powers and attributes and civilizing forces that made ordered existence possible. They included kingship and priesthood, truth and falsehood, art and music, law and war, and hundreds of other fundamental aspects of reality. Like the tablets of destiny, the me existed as givens, as features of reality that the gods administered but did not create. The myths tell us that Enki possessed the me, that he kept them in his watery domain of the Abzu. The famous myth of Inanna and Enki describes the goddess of love traveling to obtain the me from Enki, getting him drunk and carrying away the precious decrees to her own city of Uruk. But notice that neither Inanna nor Enki created the me. They possessed them, transferred them, competed for control over them, but the me themselves pre-existed any of these divine activities. They were the structure within which the gods operated, the tools they used, the powers they wielded, but they were not products of divine will. This reinforces the picture we have been assembling throughout this journey. The Anunnaki were not the source of cosmic order. They were the administrators of an order that had been established before them by forces or principles or beings above them in the hierarchy. They received the me and the tablets of destiny and the fundamental structures of reality, and they passed these on, implemented them, worked within them. But they did not originate them. The chain of command stretched above them to sources they themselves may not have fully understood. Let us turn now to the great cosmological framework within which all of this hierarchy operated, the structure of the great above and the great below, that the Sumerians described as the fundamental architecture of existence. The word An in Sumerian means heaven, the sky, the great above, and it is no coincidence that the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon bore this name. Anu, the Sky Father, the highest of the Anunnaki, took his very identity from the concept of the celestial realm. But here we must be careful to understand the relationship correctly. The concept of An, of the great above, did not derive from the god Anu. Rather, the god took his name from the pre-existing concept. An, the heavenly realm, existed as a feature of cosmic architecture before any god inhabited it. Anu became its ruler, its representative, its divine embodiment, but he did not create it. He stepped into a role that had been prepared before his existence, taking a name that described a reality more fundamental than himself. The great above was not simply the sky as we might understand it today, the blue expanse we see when we look upward on a clear day. The Mesopotamians conceived of multiple levels of heaven, realms within realms, ascending through increasing degrees of holiness and power. The lower heavens were accessible to many divine beings, but the higher heavens stretched beyond the reach of most gods, containing powers and presences that even the Anunnaki could not fully comprehend. The texts speak of heavens made of different precious stones, of jasper and lapis lazuli, and other materials that symbolized different qualities of divine presence. The highest heaven remained shrouded in mystery, the dwelling place of ultimate power, the source from which all authority ultimately descended. Below the realm of the gods and humans lay the great below, the Kai that completed the cosmic structure. This was not merely the underworld of the dead, though it included that domain. The great below encompassed the entire realm of earthly and chthonic existence, and the world of matter and death, and the mysterious forces that operated beneath the surface of things. Here ruled Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, whose authority in her own realm was absolute, unchallenged even by the great gods of the upper realms. But here also lay the Abzu, that mysterious domain of underground waters that preserved something of Apsu's primordial power. Enki made his dwelling in the Abzu, establishing himself at the boundary between the ordered world and the primordial chaos from which all things had emerged. His position there gave him unique access to wisdom and power, but it also placed him in relationship with forces that preceded and transcended the divine order he administered. The great below was not merely lower in physical position. It was more fundamental, closer to the sources, and more deeply connected to the primordial state from which creation had emerged. The Anunnaki occupied the middle realms of this cosmic structure, dwelling between the heights they could not fully reach and the depths they could not fully control. Above them stretched heavens beyond heavens, levels of divine existence that exceeded their understanding. Below them pulsed the primordial powers, the ancient forces from which they had ultimately emerged. They were intermediaries in a vast cosmic system, receiving commands from above and implementing them below, channeling the powers of the higher realms into the administration of the lower ones. This is the true position of the Anunnaki in the hierarchy of being. They were mighty, yes. They were powerful beyond human comprehension. But they were not the apex of existence, are not the source of cosmic order, not the ultimate authority from which all commands flowed. They were managers in a cosmic hierarchy, executives implementing policies they had not created, administrators of an order that had been established before the first of them drew breath. And so the architecture of existence reveals itself to our dreaming minds, layer upon layer of hierarchy, stretching from the humblest reaches of matter to the highest heavens of divine power. At the lowest level, humanity, created by the Anunnaki to serve their purposes, carrying out the labor and worship that the gods required. Above humanity, the Anunnaki themselves, those powerful beings who shaped our world and determined our fate. Above the Anunnaki, the primordial forces, Tiamat, Apsu, Mumu, and the cosmic parents who gave birth to the gods through their creative mingling. Above even these, the principles that gave form and order to the primordial chaos, the tablets of destiny, the me, the very structure of the great above and the great below. And above all, still shrouded in mystery, the ultimate source from which everything descended, the nameless power that established the foundations upon which all else was built. The ancient seekers did not rest with the comfortable hierarchy of gods above humans. They pressed further, asked deeper questions, sought higher truths. In their most sacred texts, in their most secret teachings, they reached towards something beyond all the names and forms they knew, something that even the primordial waters had emerged from. Now something that even the principles of destiny and order had their origin in. It is to this ultimate mystery that we now turn our gaze, following the ancient seekers into the darkness before all dawns, seeking the source behind all sources, the command behind all commands, the nameless one who spoke and all things came to be. We have journeyed far through the ancient records, and now we stand at the threshold of the deepest mystery, the question that even the most learned scribes of Mesopotamia approached with trembling hands and hushed voices, for we must now ask what existed before the primordial waters themselves. What was there before Tiamat and Apsu mingled their essences in the cosmic deep? And the answer takes us to the very edge of human comprehension, where language itself begins to fail, and only the poetry of silence can speak the truth. The Enuma Elish, that great Babylonian creation epic, opens with the word when, telling us that when the heavens above did not exist and the earth beneath had not come into being, there was only the mingling of the waters. But notice how the text assumes something before that. When, something it cannot name, something it can only gesture toward through negation, through telling us what did not yet exist rather than what did. And in this grammatical choice, we find the fingerprint of the ultimate mystery, the implicit acknowledgement that the scribes knew there was a before to the before, a state so primordial that even the primordial waters had not yet taken form. The ancient Sumerians, and whose civilization preceded the Babylonians by over 1,000 years, preserved an even older name for this ultimate origin, and her name was Namu, written with the cuneiform sign for the primeval sea, and she was called the mother who gave birth to heaven and earth, the primeval mother who gave birth to all the gods. And consider what this means. For if Namu gave birth to all the gods, including those primordial forces we have discussed, then Namu represents something even more fundamental than Tiamat and Apsu, a layer of existence so deep that even the cosmic parents emerge from her depths, like dreams, rising from an infinite ocean of potential. The texts describe Namu as self-generating, as having no parents of her own, as existing before existence itself had taken any recognizable form. And Here, we encounter one of the great paradoxes that the ancient seekers wrestled with in their contemplation. For how can something come from nothing? How can being emerge from non-being? And their answer was to posit a state that is neither being nor non-being, but rather pure potentiality, an infinite darkness that contains all possibilities within itself, waiting to unfold into manifestation. This primordial darkness was not conceived as empty or absent, but rather as supremely full, pregnant with everything that would ever exist, every god, every demon, every human, every grain of sand and drop of water, all contained in that original state of undifferentiated potential. And the Anunnaki themselves, those powerful beings who would later shape our world, existed in that darkness as mere possibilities, seeds waiting for the waters of existence to call them forth into form. And so we see that the hierarchy extends further back than we had imagined, beyond Tiamat and Apsu to Namu, and beyond Namu to the nameless darkness from which even she emerged. When we map this hierarchy onto the question we have been pursuing, the question of who commanded the Anunnaki, we see the chain of being with new clarity. For at the top, if we can even use spatial language for something that transcends space, there is the nameless source, the self-existent ground of all being, that the texts can only approach through negation and poetry. And from this source emerges Namu, or the primordial potential by whatever name we wish to call it. And from this potential emerge the great cosmic forces like Tiamat and Apsu. And from their mingling come the generations of gods, including the Anunnaki. And each level receives its existence and its commands from the level above, passing patterns and purposes downward through the hierarchy until they reach us, the human beings at the far end of this cosmic chain of transmission. The scribes fell silent when they approached this truth, for some mysteries cannot be written, only pointed toward. Yet in their silences, in the gaps between their words, we can perceive the outline of what they dared not name. Now we must consider how this nameless source communicated its will through the levels of the hierarchy. And here we encounter one of the most profound concepts in ancient Mesopotamian thought, the concept of the creative word, the idea that speech itself has the power to bring reality into being. And this was not mere metaphor for the ancients, but a fundamental truth about the nature of existence. For they observed that when a king spoke a decree, it became law. When a priest spoke an incantation, it changed reality. And they reasoned that the same must be true at the cosmic level, that the gods spoke and things came into being. But then they asked the deeper question, if the gods create through speech, what spoke the gods themselves into being? What was the first word, the original utterance that set all of creation in motion? The Sumerians had a word for this creative power, and they called it Nam, which can be translated as fate or essence, or that which is decreed. And Nam was understood as the fundamental force that makes things what they are. The power that decrees that fire shall burn, and water shall flow, and gods shall rule, and humans shall serve. And even the gods themselves had their name, their decreed nature that they did not choose but received from above. And so we see that Anu had his Nam as Sky Father, and Enlil had his Nam as Lord of the Command, and Enki had his Nam as Lord of Wisdom and the Waters, and none of them created these roles for themselves, but rather received them from the hierarchy above, ultimately from the nameless source that decrees all things into existence. This concept of the creative word resonates across human cultures in ways that suggest a universal recognition of this truth. For the Hebrew scriptures open with God speaking creation into existence, saying, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the Gospel of John declares that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Egyptian traditions tell of Ptah, who conceived the world in his heart and brought it forth through the words of his tongue. And the Hindu traditions speak of Om, the primordial vibration that underlies all of creation, the sound that was present before the gods themselves. And in all these traditions, we find the same insight that the Mesopotamian scribes recorded, that there is a creative power that precedes and produces the gods, a word that speaks itself into being and then speaks all else into existence. When we understand this principle of the creative word, we can see the hierarchy of commands with perfect clarity for the nameless source through whatever process remains beyond our comprehension. Speaks the primordial potential into existence, and the primordial potential speaks the cosmic forces into existence, and the cosmic forces speak the great gods into existence, and the great gods speak the lesser gods into existence, and the lesser gods speak humanity into existence. And at each level the pattern repeats, the word passing downward, the command flowing from source to recipient, and the Anunnaki who created us were themselves following a command that originated far above them, in those heights where even language fails, and only the silence of the source remains. Consider what this means for our understanding of the Anunnaki, for the word angel comes from the Greek angelos, which means messenger. And what is a messenger but one who carries commands from a higher authority to a lower one? And in this light, the Anunnaki reveal themselves not as independent creators, but as faithful transmitters of a creative impulse that originated in the nameless source itself. And when they fashioned humanity from clay and divine essence, they were not acting on their own initiative, but fulfilling a pattern that had been decreed before the primordial waters themselves took form. And so we are not merely the creation of the Anunnaki, but the great-grandchildren of the source itself, the latest expression of a creative word that has been echoing through the hierarchies of being since before time began. And so we see the Anunnaki in their true position, not as rebels, not as independent actors, but as faithful servants in a hierarchy of being that stretches beyond comprehension, receiving commands from above and implementing them below. Now let us examine more closely the textual evidence for authorities above the divine council of the Anunnaki. For the Mesopotamian texts speak frequently of the assembly of the great gods, the council where major decisions affecting heaven and earth were made, and this assembly typically numbered 50 great gods who had the power to determine fates and issue decrees. And even Anu, the sky father and nominal head of the pantheon, submitted to the decisions of this council. But here we must ask the crucial question: who established this council? Who set its rules and determined its membership? Who gave it the authority to determine fates? For if the council is the highest authority, then there should be no power above it. Yet the texts suggest otherwise, pointing to decisions that were declared rather than debated, fates that were fixed before the council ever convened, assignments that the gods received rather than chose. In the Atrahasis Epic, when the gods grow weary of their labor and the Igigi rebel against their workload, the decision to create humanity as a replacement labor force is presented as arising from the council. Yet there are hints that this decision was following a pattern already established, a destiny already written on the tablets of fate, and the gods themselves seem to be implementing a plan rather than inventing one, executing orders rather than originating them. And when Enki designs the first human being, he does so according to specifications that he received rather than conceived, following a template that was decreed before his own birth. And so even this most intimate act of creation, the making of humanity, was an act of obedience to higher authority. The relationship between the Anunnaki and the Igigi provides a clear example of how the hierarchy functioned. For the Igigi were the working class of the divine realm, the lesser gods who performed the manual labor of maintaining creation, digging the channels and carrying the loads that kept the cosmos functioning. And they served under the Anunnaki, who were their supervisors and commanders. But the Anunnaki themselves were not the ultimate authority. They too received their assignments from above. And so we see a pattern of delegation that extends through all levels of the hierarchy, from the nameless source through the primordial powers, through the great gods to the lesser gods, and finally to humanity, each level receiving authority from above and delegating tasks to below, each level operating within constraints it did not create, following rules it did not write, fulfilling a purpose that originated in the depths of the source itself. What this means for the Anunnaki narrative is profound, for they were not the ultimate powers we sometimes imagine them to be. They were not acting independently or rebelliously, but faithfully executing a cosmic plan that descended to them from heights beyond imagination. And their creation of humanity was not an arbitrary decision or a desperate measure, but the fulfillment of a pattern encoded in the structure of existence itself. A command that flowed down through the hierarchy from the source, through Namu, through Tiamat and Apsu, through Anu and Enlil, until it reached Enki, who finally implemented it by fashioning the first human being from clay and the blood of a sacrificed god. The picture emerges with increasing clarity. The Anunnaki were not masters, but servants, not sources, but channels, and what flowed through them came from heights beyond imagining. And now we come to the ultimate revelation, the synthesis of everything we have discovered in our journey through the forbidden texts, the complete mapping of the hierarchy that answers at last our central question of who commanded the commanders. And let us begin at the top and work our way down through the levels of being that separate the nameless source from humanity. At the first and highest level, if such spatial language can even apply to that which transcends all space and time, there exists the nameless source, the self-existent ground of being from which all else emerges, that which the texts cannot name because it precedes all naming, that which they cannot describe because it precedes all description, the darkness before the darkness, the silence before the silence, the potential before the potential. And this source is not a god among gods, but the ground of gods, not a being among beings, but the ground of being itself. And the ancient scribes approached this truth with the same reverence that mystics of all ages have brought to the encounter with the Absolute, knowing that they stood at the edge of what human minds can comprehend. At the second level, we find the first manifestation of the source, the creative principle that some texts call Namu, and others approach through the concept of the creative word, the Nam that decrees all things into their essential nature, the first stirring of potential toward actuality, the first differentiation within their infinite unity, And this level represents the transition from the utterly transcendent to the merely inconceivably vast, the first step down the ladder of being that will eventually reach our own small rung. At the third level, we find the primordial powers that we explored earlier, Tiamat, the salt sea, and Apsu, the fresh water, and Mumu, the forming principle, the cosmic forces that emerged from the primordial potential and whose mingling gave rise to the generations of gods. And these beings, vast as they are, ancient as they are, powerful as they are nonetheless received their existence and their nature from the levels above them, operating within a structure they did not create, following patterns they did not design. At the fourth level, we find the great Anunnaki themselves, Anu the Sky Father, Enlil the Lord of Command, Enki the Lord of Wisdom, and the other major deities who rule the cosmic order and interact most directly with humanity. And now we see them in their proper context, not as ultimate powers, but as administrators of a cosmic structure that descends from incomprehensible heights, mighty beings certainly, shapers of worlds and makers of humanity, but servants nonetheless, taking orders from above and implementing them below. At the fifth level, we find the lesser gods, the Igigi, the demons and spirits and minor deities who populate the Mesopotamian cosmos, and carrying out the detailed work of maintaining creation under the direction of the Anunnaki. And at the sixth level, at the bottom of this great hierarchy, we find humanity, created to serve the gods who serve the primordials, who serve the source, the latest and lowest expression of a creative impulse that originated in the nameless depths before time began. This hierarchy was not hidden from the ancient peoples. It was embedded in their texts and their rituals and their understanding of the cosmos. But it was approached with reverence and taught in stages. For the exoteric religion of the temples presented the gods in their accessible forms, as beings who could be appeased and petitioned and understood, while the esoteric wisdom of the scribes pointed toward the deeper truths, the nameless source, the creative word, the hierarchy of being that stretches beyond human comprehension. And this is not because the truth was deliberately suppressed, but because ultimate truth cannot be conveyed directly. It can only be pointed toward, approached asymptotically, glimpsed in moments of contemplation, and then carried in the heart as a seed of wonder that continues to unfold throughout a lifetime. The forbidden knowledge we have revealed tonight was always there, inscribed on clay tablets that have survived for thousands of years, waiting in museum basements and academic journals for someone to ask the right questions. And the right question was never simply, who were the Anunnaki, or where did they come from, but rather, who commanded them, who stood above them in the hierarchy of being. And when we ask that question, the texts begin to speak in ways they never spoke before, revealing levels upon levels of authority stretching upward into the infinite mystery of the source itself. The Anunnaki remain powerful and important in this understanding. They are still our creators, still the shapers of our world, still the beings who interact most directly with humanity. But they are not the ultimate story. They are part of a greater story, characters in a cosmic drama whose author transcends all names and forms. And when we see them in this context, we see ourselves more clearly as well, as beings who exist at the far end of a hierarchy that connects us, through the Anunnaki, through the primordials, through Namu to the nameless source itself. And so the forbidden texts have spoken. The Anunnaki, those mighty beings who shaped our world, were themselves shaped by powers beyond them. They took orders from the primordial forces that gave them birth, and those forces emerged from the nameless, formless source that underlies all existence. The chain of command stretches from that ultimate origin through countless hierarchies of being, down through the Anunnaki, and ultimately to us, children of the children of the children of the infinite. And as we rest in this understanding, a final question remains. What does this revelation mean for us? What is our place in this vast hierarchy? And what commands might still flow down through the ages, seeking fulfillment in the present day? And so we arrive at the place where cosmic truth meets the quiet chamber of your own heart, at where the vast hierarchies we have traced through ancient texts and primordial waters come to rest within the vessel of human understanding. For you see, everything we have discovered about the Anunnaki and the powers that commanded them leads inevitably to this single profound question. What does it mean for us, for you, for the consciousness that even now receives these words in the stillness of this moment? The ancient scribes who pressed their styluses into wet clay thousands of years ago were not merely recording the affairs of distant gods, but were mapping the very structure of existence itself, a structure in which humanity holds a position both humble and extraordinary. For we stand at the current endpoint of a chain of delegation that stretches back through the Anunnaki, through the primordial forces of Tiamat and Apsu, through the nameless source itself, and in this position we carry within our very being the pattern that runs through all levels of the hierarchy. Consider for a moment what this truly means. The consciousness with which you perceive these words, the awareness that allows you to contemplate the infinite. This is not some accident of biological evolution alone, but is rather the spark of the ultimate source transmitted down through each successive level of the cosmic order, passed from the nameless origin to the primordial waters, from the primordial waters to the first gods, from the first gods to the Anunnaki, and from the Anunnaki to us, so that when you turn your attention inward and encounter the mystery of your own awareness, you are in some sense encountering a reflection, however distant and filtered, of the ultimate consciousness that underlies all things. The Mesopotamian texts tell us that humanity was created to serve the gods, to take up the labors that the lesser deities, the Igigi, had rebelled against. And on the surface, this might seem to diminish our significance, to reduce us to mere servants in a cosmic household. But when we understand the full hierarchy, this service takes on an entirely different meaning. For the gods themselves served higher powers, and those powers served still higher principles, and all service ultimately flows upward toward the source. So perhaps our true purpose, our deepest calling, is not merely to serve the Anunnaki, but to participate in the great movement of service that characterizes every level of existence. We're to align ourselves with the cosmic pattern that runs from the highest to the lowest and back again. And perhaps this explains something about the human experience that has puzzled philosophers and seekers throughout the ages. The persistent sense of purpose that drives us, the intuitions that guide us towards certain paths, the inspirations that arrive unbidden in moments of stillness, the callings that we feel but cannot fully explain. Perhaps these are not merely the products of our individual psyches, but are echoes of commands from the highest levels of the hierarchy, still flowing down through the cosmic structure, still seeking fulfillment in the present moment. For if the hierarchy remains intact, if the chain of delegation still functions as it did when the first tablets were inscribed, then we may still be receiving communications from levels far beyond our conscious comprehension. Guidance encoded in the very fabric of our being. Directions written not in cuneiform, but in the language of the soul. Our relationship to the Anunnaki, then, is not one of slaves to masters or creatures to creators in any simple sense. For we share with them the same ultimate origin. We are children of the same source, expressions of the same primordial pattern. And if they are our makers in one sense, they are also our elder siblings in another, further along the path of cosmic unfoldment. But walking the same path nonetheless, not to be worshipped as ultimate beings, but to be understood as guides and intermediaries within a hierarchy that transcends them as surely as it transcends us. As we consider our place in this vast cosmic order, we might find comfort rather than insignificance, peace rather than anxiety. For we are not accidents adrift in a meaningless void, not orphans abandoned in an indifferent universe, but children of an incomprehensible lineage, heirs to a tradition that stretches back before the stars themselves were kindled. And here we discover something remarkable. The Mesopotamian understanding of hierarchy finds echoes in virtually every spiritual tradition that humanity has developed, as if cultures separated by oceans and millennia all somehow intuited the same fundamental structure of reality. In the Hebrew tradition, we find the word Elohim, a plural form that suggests a divine council, a multiplicity of powers that yet answers to a higher unity. And above this, council stands YHDOWH, the name that is above all names. The divine presence that Moses encountered in the burning bush, too sacred to be spoken aloud, and above even this personal God, the mystics of Kabbalah perceived Ein Sof, the infinite without end, the nameless source from which all emanations flow, including the very God who spoke to the prophets. The angelic hierarchies of later Jewish and Christian thought, the seraphim and cherubim, and thrones and dominions, these too reflect the understanding that between humanity and the ultimate there exist vast orders of beings, each serving the level above, each transmitting the divine will downward through the cosmic structure. In the Greek tradition, we find the same pattern clothed in different garments. Before the Olympian gods whom Homer celebrated, there were the Titans, the elder powers who ruled in a previous age. And before the Titans, there was chaos, the primordial void from which all things emerged, and the philosophers who came after the poets, Plato and Plotinus, and their successors, developed this intuition into a sophisticated understanding of emanation, of the one beyond all being from which successive levels of reality flow forth like light from an infinite sun, each level less perfect than its source, yet each participating in the divine nature according to its capacity. In the East, we find perhaps the clearest expressions of this hierarchical truth. In Hinduism, the countless gods and goddesses of popular devotion are understood by the wise to be manifestations of a single ultimate reality, Brahman, the infinite consciousness that is the ground of all being. And the Upanishads speak of this truth in words that could have come from the lips of a Mesopotamian sage, declaring that all this is Brahman, that the self within is one with the self of all, that the apparent multiplicity of gods and beings is but the play of a single infinite awareness. Buddhism, too, with its realms of devas and hungry ghosts and hell beings, presents a cosmic hierarchy of existence, yet always pointing beyond all conditioned realms to the unconditioned, to nirvana, to the cessation of all grasping and becoming. And in Chinese thought, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, the nameless source of heaven and earth, the mother of all things, prior to all gods and spirits, beyond all categories and conceptions. This universal recognition suggests something profound, that the Mesopotamian scribes, among the first to commit such knowledge to writing, were not inventing, but discovering, not creating mythology, but perceiving reality. And the hierarchy they mapped in their clay tablets reflects not cultural fantasy, but cosmic structure, the actual architecture of existence that wise seekers in every age and place have somehow apprehended. Around the world, in every age, wise seekers have looked beyond the gods to find the source of the gods. And the Mesopotamian scribes were among the first to write it down. But they were not alone in their understanding. And this convergence of insight across such vast gulfs of time and culture may be the strongest evidence we have that the hierarchy is real, that we inhabit a structured cosmos, that the Anunnaki truly did take orders from powers above them, powers that remain active and present, though hidden from our ordinary perception. And yet, having journeyed so far, having traced the chain of command from the Anunnaki through the primordial powers to the nameless source itself, we must acknowledge what we cannot know, must confess the limits of even the most profound understanding, for the ultimate mystery remains mysterious. The nameless remains beyond all names, the source that gave rise to Tiamat and Apsu, and the Anunnaki, and us remains forever, beyond the reach of words and concepts. The ancient scribes knew this, and their wisest texts reflect this knowing, speaking of the highest truth only in negations and silences, pointing toward what cannot be grasped, gesturing toward what cannot be seen. And perhaps this is as it should be. For if the ultimate could be captured in human words or human thoughts, it would not be ultimate, and the very incomprehensibility of the source is testimony to its transcendence. But the mystery need not be a source of frustration or despair, for there is a way of relating to mystery that brings not anxiety, but peace, not confusion, but clarity of a deeper kind. And the wise in every tradition have testified that the seeking is as valuable as the finding, that the journey toward truth is itself a form of truth, that to genuinely grapple with the great questions is to participate in something sacred, regardless of whether final answers are ever reached. The hierarchy we have discovered invites ongoing contemplation. For each level we examine reveals new questions, new depths, new wonders, and the journey of understanding never truly ends, is spiraling ever deeper into mystery, ever higher into light. And we must remember that the story is not fully told, that thousands of Mesopotamian tablets remain untranslated in museum basements around the world, waiting for scholars with the patience and insight to unlock their secrets. And who knows what revelations these silent witnesses may contain? What further details of the cosmic hierarchy may emerge as future generations of seekers continue the work of understanding? Perhaps there are levels we have not yet imagined, connections we have not yet perceived, truths that will only become apparent when the right questions are finally asked. This is an invitation, then, extended across the ages from the ancient scribes to you who listen now in the quiet of this night. These questions are not merely academic, not merely historical, but touch on the deepest aspects of existence, on your existence, on the meaning and purpose of the consciousness that even now receives these words. Everyone can engage with this mystery. Everyone can participate in the ongoing work of understanding for the hierarchy that runs from the nameless source through all levels of being terminates. For now, in us, and we alone among the creatures of Earth, have the capacity to turn back toward our origins and ask the questions that matter most. And there is peace in this understanding, even partial understanding, even understanding that knows its own limits. For to know your place in the hierarchy is to have context for existence, to have a frame within which life makes sense, to know that the cosmos is ordered rather than chaotic, meaningful rather than absurd. That we belong to something vast and meaningful, something that began before time and will continue after time has ceased to be measured. And in this belonging, there is rest, there is completion, there is the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be, playing exactly the role you are meant to play in a cosmic drama scripted by intelligence beyond all comprehension. And so we arrive at the edge of sleep, carrying with us the vision of hierarchies stretching beyond comprehension, of powers and principalities and cosmic orders, flowing one from another in an endless procession of delegation and service. The Anunnaki, those ancient ones who shaped our world and our very flesh, look upward still toward the primordial powers that gave them being, and those primordial powers, Tiamat and Apsu and Mumu, rest in their ancient dreaming while remaining ever aware of the nameless source that called them forth from non-existence into the first stirrings of cosmic creativity. And above all, beneath all, within all, the nameless source holds everything in being, sustains every level of the hierarchy in every moment, dreams the dream in which gods and mortals and all things between have their existence. Let this understanding settle into you now, like sediment drifting down through dark waters. Let it permeate your awareness as sleep begins to soften the edges of thought. Let it accompany you into whatever realms of rest and dream await. For the truth we have discovered tonight is not merely information, but is itself a kind of presence, a living reality that can transform the quality of consciousness when allowed to do its slow and gentle work. You have traced the lineage of the gods. You have climbed the ladder of hierarchy. You have glimpsed the outlines of the source from which all things flow, and this knowledge is now yours, a gift from the ancient scribes who first recorded these truths, transmitted across millennia to reach you in this moment of stillness and receptivity. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will appear subtly different, touched by the understanding that beneath its surface, chaos lies an order more profound than human minds can fully fathom, a hierarchy of service and delegation that runs from the highest heights to the deepest depths, including within its scope the very awareness with which you perceive it. And so we return now to where we began, to the desert night, to the silence that stretches across the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates still wind their way toward the sea as they have for countless millennia. And above this sacred ground, the same stars burn in the darkness, the very same stars that the Sumerian scribes watched from their temple towers as they pressed their reed styluses into soft clay, recording the truths that have traveled across the ages to reach us here in this quiet moment, and what a journey we have taken together through those ancient records, asking the question that so few have dared to ask. Who commanded the commanders? Who ruled the rulers? Who gave orders to the Anunnaki themselves? And the tablets have answered us, revealing hierarchy upon hierarchy, stretching upward into the incomprehensible heights of existence. From the Anunnaki who shaped our world, we trace the chain of being upward to the primordial powers, to Tiamat and Apsu and the mysterious Mumu, those vast consciousnesses who preceded the gods and gave them birth. And beyond even these ancient ones, we glimpsed the nameless source, the self-existent ground from which all being emerges, the silent origin that cannot be spoken but only pointed toward in reverent wonder. And now, as this knowledge settles into your awareness, like sediment drifting down through still waters, perhaps you feel not smallness but belonging, for you are part of this great chain of being, the pattern that runs from the source through every level of existence pulses within you even now. The same commands that shape the cosmos echo still in your very cells, in the rhythm of your breath, in the beating of your heart. There is comfort in knowing our place within the ordered cosmos. There is peace in understanding that the hierarchy holds all things in their proper position. There is rest in trusting that the same source which commanded the Anunnaki continues its eternal work of holding everything in being. And so, as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift like clouds across a moonlit sky, may the ancient wisdom of the scribes accompany you into your rest. May the nameless source that underlies all existence hold you gently in its infinite embrace. May the great commands of the cosmos that flow down through every hierarchy bring you the peace that passes understanding, and may your dreams tonight touch the primordial waters from which all creation once emerged and to which all creation shall one day return. The forbidden knowledge is yours now. The hierarchy above the Anunnaki stands revealed, and in the great silence beyond all words and all names and all forms, the source of all continues its eternal contemplation, dreaming the vast dream in which gods and mortals and stars and stones all have their being. You are held, you are known, you are part of the infinite. Rest well now, traveler of ancient mysteries. Rest well beneath the timeless stars. Rest well, and let sleep carry you gently into the deep. Rest well, rest well, rest well.